Just want to add a reminder about the conference that's now a couple months away. It's April 6th through 8th, which is Easter weekend. We'll start with a Friday evening meeting around 6:30, I think. And then Saturday all day we'll have a couple morning sessions, some afternoon sessions, perhaps like a couples or marriage session, and then an evening meeting. And then Sunday we'll have 2 sessions, like we normally do with those conferences. So please be in prayer about it as well. That's a big part of our ministry as a church, is blessing others with or hosting an opportunity for others to hear God's word. And we look forward to having Brother Zach here with us that weekend. Okay, 1 Timothy chapter 6. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for speaking to us already. Thank you, Lord, that your word doesn't let us go. And that's a good thing, Lord, because you hound us in love. You watch over us, you chase after us, you open your arms wide, and you long to see it. Your plans for us are for our welfare, not for our calamity. Sometimes we hear hard words, Lord, spoken to us, and they're good for us. They're for our welfare. I pray that you will give us all, Lord, a secure foundation in your love so that we can receive everything that you have to say, knowing that everything you allow to happen in our lives is for our good. You will turn it into our good. It might not seem good. It might not seem enjoyable. It might not seem pleasant in the moment. But because of the promises in your word, we can be absolutely certain that you will turn it into good. You're in the business of turning the tables on all the damage the devil has done. He's tied knots in our lives and you're untying them, Lord. You're freeing us from these things because you're a good God, a loving Father. And I see my own children and I know how much love for them you have put in my own heart. And it's just a picture, it's a drop in the ocean compared to your love for me and for us, your children. I pray, Lord, that you will give us, that's all of us here, that none of us here will ever doubt your love for us. Thank you that is the secret to victory. That is the secret to freedom from anxiety and cares and worries and depression, discouragement, lack of joy in our lives, lack of peace, lack of love. Help us, Lord, to be secure in the foundation of your love. Thank you, you will do it. Speak to us again this morning in your love for us. In Jesus' name, amen. 1 Timothy chapter 6. No, I'm sorry. We're still in chapter 5. I skipped ahead. We're in chapter 5, verse 17 onwards. We read up to verse 16 last week and studied that. I'm going to continue beginning in verse 17, and the title of my message is The Responsibility and Honor of Elders. This is a very important message for me to share with you because it gives me an opportunity, and if Phil were here, I'm sure he would do the same. In fact, he did back in October, I think it was, when we were in the earlier chapters in 1 Timothy chapter 3, where he talked about the responsibility of elders there as well. There's a slightly different tack here in chapter 5, but it's still important. I wanted, and I'm thankful that the Lord has us here to give me the opportunity to speak from my heart about what I see as my responsibility here in the church. What is my responsibility in your lives? If you've committed your life here to the local church and to our care as elders in the church, what can you expect from me? How should I be living before God's face? And so this is a message to myself. First of all, it has been. But it's also now a message that I'm sharing with you. You all will have areas of responsibility in your life where this principle of eldership will apply. In the home, in your marriage situations, in your interactions as men with your wives or parents with your children, in your work situation, if you oversee somebody in your work, those sorts of things. All of us has a sphere of influence. And God wants us to act on the principles that He has shown us in His Word. So first of all, He says, I want you as a church, it says, the judgment must begin with the household of God. And so if we want to see these principles enacted in the world, in our earthly interactions, He says, let it start in the church. And let it start with the elders. Let the elders first show you how to be a leader. And if we're not doing that, then God is going to convict us. And He's been convicting me about that. So that's what this message is about in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Let's read verses 17 through the end of the chapter, verse 25. 1 Timothy 5, we'll begin reading in verse 17. Concerning elders, the elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who continue in sin rebuke in the presence of all, so that the rest also will be fearful of sinning. I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus and of his chosen angels to maintain these principles without bias, doing nothing in a spirit of partiality. Do not lay hands upon anyone too hastily and thereby share responsibility for the sins of others. Keep yourself free from sin. No longer drink water exclusively, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments. The sins of some men are quite evident, going before them to judgment. For others, their sins follow after them. Likewise also, deeds that are good are quite evident, and those which are otherwise cannot be concealed. I'm going to start by, if you've been here for a little bit, you know I like to make up a few words. I'm going to make up a word here. It's called Demurrer. You've heard of pyramid schemes. I'm going to talk to you about Demurrer schemes. You know what a pyramid scheme is? See, in the world, there's this principle that any organization, for it to have any structure, is going to have a pyramid. Somebody at the top who's ultimately accountable. Even in government, we see that. I think it was Truman or one of the presidents used to have first put a sign there in the Oval Office that said, "The buck stops here." And it's, I think it's still sitting there as far as I know. But ultimately what that phrase means is you can blame somebody else and if somebody fails, they can say, well, my leadership, it's a reflection on the leadership fails. That's why when there's a problem, for instance, you see this in the military. If there's a problem with some of the soldiers, they go to the leadership and say, hey, you guys were in charge of these people, and you let that happen. And the leaders take some accountability for that. And some of them have to step down. And you can pass the buck, pass the blame, as it were, so up to the point where the person at the top of the leadership says, I take responsibility. But in terms of companies and things like that, ultimately there's this, you know what I mean by that. There's a pyramid scheme. There's an organization where at the very top is the guy who's in charge of everything, and you dare not speak against him. And he's the one that everybody serves. He makes the most amount of money because he's at the very top. And everybody else gets a little filter off that, some portion of that, it breaks down. And the person at the bottom, at the very base of it, he's just like the bottom rung guy. Nobody really thinks about him. When they think of a company, they think about the person who's at the top. He's the most important person. That's the way things are organized in the world. That's the spirit of the world. And that's why I call it the Demurrer scheme, which is just the word pyramid backwards. That's all it is. But I believe in the church that the way God has organized the church is exactly the opposite. And I'm not just making this up. It sounds cute. I use that visual only just to help you remember it, to see that if you are the greatest in the church, the most important person in the church is not perhaps the elder or the person who's the most visible, the person who does the most outwardly, is not necessarily the most important or the greatest member in the church. The greatest member in the church, if you look at the example that Jesus set us, it's interesting to see who that is. Let me start by showing you how Jesus who has been exalted to the highest place. And when you think high like that, right? But look at how Jesus got to that highest place. Turn with me to Philippians chapter 2, and we'll see what was the journey Jesus took. So, in the corporate world, they talk about climbing the corporate ladder. It's a common phrase. If you're trying to make it to the CEO, to be the CEO of a company, you better work your way up. Maybe you start out at the bottom of that pyramid and you're working your way up. You get a little bit more experience and a little bit more, you do a good job and they're promoting you. You're climbing the corporate ladder. The exact opposite is the case in the church. Look at this in Philippians chapter 2. Let's begin reading in verse 5. This is how Jesus got to he finishes by saying, in verse 9. Let me show you that first. How did Jesus get to the place of high exaltation where he reached the highest point in the church? He's the head of the church. He's the leader of the church. How did he get there? For this reason also, verse 9, God highly exalted him. This is the highest. In other words, he, if you could use the earthly term, climbed the corporate ladder till he reached the very top. He highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, everybody else will bow to him, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. How did he get there? If you were an earthly person and you watched a CEO say, man, I started in this company as a janitor or cleaning the floors, and I worked my way up, and now I'm the CEO. He could write a book about how he became so successful, how he climbed to the very top of that corporate ladder and became the ruler. But here's how Jesus got to this place where God highly exalted him. Back up in verse 5. He says, have this attitude in the church, my dear brother, sister, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. What he's saying here is he was already God. He was equal with God. And he said, I'm not going to hold on to this position. I'm not going to hold on to this being seated up here in heaven and beyond temptation. I'm not going to hold on to this. I'm not going to grasp onto this. He did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped and held on tightly to, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient. Look at this journey he was on. Becoming obedient, and then becoming obedient, and becoming obedient, and becoming obedient until the point of death. Even death on the cross. For this reason, God has also highly exalted him. Do you see how Jesus climbed the corporate ladder, the spiritual ladder, if you will? And you see how it's a way of being obedient and humbling myself and forsaking all those things that I'm so proud of and the reputation that others in the church have of me. And he's speaking about elders here. We're still talking about elders. But I want to share with you this principle that you will find in your home, husband, in your home, father, mother, in your workplace, employee or employer or manager or whatever it is you're doing. If you have this attitude that he says, first of all, elders, you need to have this in the church. If I want to be your leader, if I am to be your leader, God has placed me in the church to be your leader and example as an elder in the church. But if I am to be that, I must follow the great shepherd, the true elder of the church, the head of the church himself, in becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Jesus said this. Turn over to Mark chapter 9. Jesus made this very, very plain. Because you see, I want to set you the context of the verse we're about to read. The disciples, I think, if I understand the Gospels correctly, the disciples got a sense of entitlement after they'd been with Jesus for a little while. They started to see, that there's, I think, I'm reading into the Gospels a little bit, but I think it's correct here. And they changed, well, let's not be too hard on the disciples. We would have been exactly like them, I think. Many of them were better than us. They forsook everything to follow Jesus. So we won't be too hard on them, but I think there was an aspect of when they were with Jesus, they kind of got this entitlement because they were with Jesus. And they really believed he was the Son of God and the Messiah. And they looked at all these other people and they looked down on him. You remember one point where they said, hey, John the Baptist's disciples are also baptizing. What should we do? Should we call down fire on them? There was that sense of entitlement, like, hey, Jesus, we're the true church. And look at those people. They're also claiming to be Christians and they're doing it differently from us. He says, you don't know what you're talking about. There was that sense of entitlement that they had. And the result of that was that they felt important. And look at what happens here in Mark chapter 9. We'll read verse 35. Sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, if anyone... Well, I want to... let's back up to 33. That's where it is. So 33, Mark chapter 9, verse 33. So they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, they were walking to Capernaum, and on the way they had been talking about something. And so he says he began to question them, what were you talking about on the way? He says, hey, I noticed you guys were having a conversation back there. I was walking, and maybe I was praying or talking to somebody else, but I noticed you guys were in a pretty heated conversation. What were you talking about? What were you discussing on the way? And they kept silent, because on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. They said, okay, we know Jesus is the greatest. He's our master. But among us 12, who do you think is the greatest? And Peter says, well, it's probably me, or maybe, he says, Andrew says, well, you can't be you because I called you. I told you about Jesus. And I imagine this argument going on. Or James says, no, it was me and I called John. Or we got called first and, Jesus hangs out with us more. Peter, James, and John could have said that. So we're more important. They were probably having that kind of conversation that you and I would have had if we were in their shoes. And then he called the 12 and said to them, these are the disciples who had forsaken everything, who were having this conversation about who is the most important person among our midst, Jesus. Yeah, we know you're the head of the church and all that, but in this local church, who is the most important person? Who is the one who is worthy of the greatest honor? And he said, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and the servant of all. In the next chapter, Mark chapter 10, he says similar words. Mark 10, verse 44. See what happened, you know the story, I won't read the whole story in the interest of time, but James and John, you know, they came to Jesus and said, well actually their mom came with them, you know, there were a couple of mama's boys, Jesus picks mama's boys too. James and John, Mrs. Zebedee came with her two boys who are, by the way, about 28, 29 years old at this time, and holds them by the hand and says, hey Jesus, my two 28 and 29, my two boys who are in their late 20s, I want to ask you something for them. You see that what's going on here? And she says, you know, we want to sit at your right and your left hand. In this version of the account, it doesn't say that their mom came. You can read it in another gospel. But essentially, that's what happened. And so James and John, and Jesus says, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, what do you think the other 10 disciples were thinking? They're like, what? Who gave you the right to ask for that right and left hand? And so they were upset at the right hand. Hearing this, verse 41, Mark 10:41, the 10 other disciples began to feel angry, indignant with James and John. I think they were a little bit jealous. They thought, wow, Jesus, maybe because they asked first, they'll get it. And there was a little bit of that indignation going on. And then calling them to himself, Jesus said, what is this? You guys fighting for who's going to be the most important? Who's going to get to do this or get to do that? I'm talking about the church here. I'm talking about our relationship in the church and how you view your role in the church. Are you looking for a role where some people ask you to lead the Bible study or preach the sermon or lead the music or do something like that? Do you think that's important? Do you covet that role in the church where everybody thinks of you when they think of River of Life Christian Fellowship? And Jesus said, you know, verse 42, that those who are recognized as rulers, look at that picture again, the pyramid. Those who are recognized as rulers in the world, as the Gentiles, lord it over them. They love that, you know, the comfortable chair and the corner office with the window and the view and all that. They love those things. That's the world. The lords of the rulers of the world, lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But he was talking to these people who would be the apostles and the leaders of his church. The true church, he says, if you want to understand the church, it is not to be this way among you. It must be the exact opposite. You must take that pyramid and turn it on its head if you want to understand leadership and rulership in the church. He says, I'm telling you, disciples, you guys are going to be leaders in churches. You're going to be elders. You're going to have leaders and you're going to be apostles traveling around and exercising authority. Be careful how you do it. He's speaking to elders now in the church, excuse me. He's speaking to you fathers, to you husbands, to you parents. How will you exercise that authority? It is not this way among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man, He's shown you the greatest example, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life ransom for many. You know, if we really understand this, all of a sudden, that eldership position doesn't seem so attractive after all. Somebody comes to you and says, now I want you to be an elder in the church. You think, if you really understood, and I'll be honest with you, when the Lord made it clear that He was calling me to be an elder here in the church through Phil and through Zach and others, the situation as it worked out in 2008, there was a fear that came upon my heart. Because He took me to this passage. He says, do you really want it? They're going to, not you, but He says there's an aspect in which your life will be responsible and accountable and taken advantage of. You'll be the servant of all. I'm calling you to take the responsibility for the dirtiest job of all. Do you still want it? And that's a call that's coming out to all of you. It's not just the elders. Maybe God doesn't put you in a position of responsibility in the church, but He's given you that responsibility. And my dear leader, and I speak men, women, and children, in the areas of influence where God is calling you to be a leader, and He is. If you ask Him for wisdom, He'll show you those areas of responsibility. He wants to see, do you covet this Spirit of Christ that says, even the Son of Man did not come to be served. I'm not going to be a leader of the church because they're going to serve me, and I'm going to get the special parking spot. You know, you go to some churches, they have the front row spot is for the pastors, and then his wife is right next to him too. For even the Son of Man did not come to take the best parking spot or to have the best seat in the house or anything like that. Did not come to be served, but to serve and to give His life a ransom for many. This is the church. This is leadership in the church. This is how God exercises His authority in the church. Do you want it? I hope you do. It's the most joyful, abundantly vibrant life you could live. Jesus proved that. He was at peace in all His circumstance. Therefore, God has highly exalted Him, given Him a name above every other name. Very, very important. And It's this principle, essentially, if you think about it. Acts 20, verse 35. If you can understand your responsibility and your interaction with each other in the church, think about it like this. It is more blessed to give than to receive. The earthly pyramids are built like this, that the more you receive more commendation and more responsibility and a greater reputation. The world tells you it's more blessed to receive. Go up, go up, go up. Climb the ladder, climb the ladder. It's more blessed to receive. And the call of the Holy Spirit in the church is, no, it's not. It's more blessed to give. Will you give until nobody even realizes that you're giving? Then you've understood the spirit of the church. Then you're going down and you're realizing that you're following the Son of Man who did not come to be served, but to serve and to give himself, to give his life. It's more blessed to give, even your life, a ransom for many. God will build a church through us, dear brothers and sisters, if we have understood this principle. I also want to talk now, just shifting gears a little bit, about the responsibility or why we believe in plurality of elders. I felt it was a good opportunity for me to talk about this. Why, most churches that at least I've been to, have a sole leadership model, where there's the senior pastor or somebody like that who's the ultimate chief, the big dog, as it were, if you use the term the world uses. He's the guy that has the most responsibility and things like that. Now, we believe in this church, and we've administered it that way, that elders must be plural. And you'll see the reason for that is because that's the principle you see in the book of Acts. As you read the book of Acts, how the apostles established churches, they appointed elders, plural, every single time. Appointed elders in each local church. But there's a reason for it. There's a principle behind this. First of all, I believe, and this is the reason why I think it's important for this plurality of elders, is because we teach submission in the church. In other words, if you choose to attend this church and become a part of the local body here, there's a sense in which God expects you to submit to the eldership in the church here. That's a responsibility you have. But you make that choice, first of all. If you choose to become in coming to the local church, says, I'm committing to this body and submitting to the eldership in the church here, you make a choice there. It's never forced from above. Jesus said that. In the world, they lord it from above. In the church, here's elders serving, and different ones come and place the responsibility of their souls, like Hebrews 13, verse 17 says, on these elders who are bearing that responsibility. So the elder is not grabbing people and saying, here, come, let me take the responsibility of your soul. The person is entrusting themselves to that care. You see that? That's the opposite model. But in that submission, in other words, in showing the church, the members in the church, that importance of submission, it's important for the elders themselves to demonstrate that submission by their own example. And I hope you see that in our relationship, in Phil and I, in our relationship with each other, that God must first prove that he and I, are willing to submit to one another, to each other, in our working together. In other words, if I say, well, this is how I feel it should be done in the church, and Phil says, no, I'm not sure, I don't have a clearing on the Lord, and the Lord immediately puts a check in my heart and says, now you need to submit. And in that submission, you need to set an example to the rest of the church on how to submit. We may not agree on that particular thing, but then I say, okay, Lord, I'm going to submit. And we have made a choice. This is how it practically works out, that we will never move forward in the leadership or the administration of this church unless we're both in unity on that. And if one person feels strongly, well, I see it in God's word, and this is how it must be, etc., etc., I will forego my conviction in that area until the Lord is able to bring us in unity. I'll tell you, that's how Megan and I believe we should live in our home as well. Husbands and wives, this applies there. If I feel strongly about something, and I'm going to go ahead and do it in any way, I'm not talking about areas of sin or things like that, but there are certain areas in which I might feel a particular conviction, and I feel like the Lord very often, most often, I won't say this every time, most often the Lord says, you need to wait on your wife to have that conviction as well, so that you can walk in it together. Even our taking the step of faith to come here to Colorado was that. The Lord said, you might feel that that's where the Lord's leading you, but wait on your wife. Do it in unity, and you will see that in that conviction there is a power that comes through that unity and through that agreement. And it's the same thing in the church. That's why there must be two elders who say, we're going to submit to one another, now follow me as I follow Christ in that submission. Who himself submitted to the Father, with whom he was equal. You see that? Jesus himself was equal to the Father from the beginning of time, and he humbled himself, like we read in Philippians 2, made himself of no reputation, and became obedient to the point of death, and he says, now follow me. I chose a way of submission to my Father. You do it too, and you will see that resurrection power come through your life. That's how the church is built. It's not through people grabbing authority and playing the political game and they've got their favorites and things like that. Many churches in Christendom are trying to build their churches this way. The Holy Spirit is not there, I don't believe. The anointing is gone because he sees that we would rather build churches according to the world's model of this person at the top who everybody looks up to and he's the guru or he's whatever we call his name. Instead, we're building the church according to God's way. So it's important that example of submission is there. Secondly, there must be a balance in that vision and administration because elders, individuals will always have different personalities and certain strengths. We're not perfect, only Jesus Christ is perfect, but he has called us all as a body so that we balance each other out. And that's signified and demonstrated best in the elders who themselves have each other to balance each other out. And that's why God has given plurality of elders in this church as well, so that we balance each other out, so that there's a check, there's accountability. I have that up there as well. And secondly, and also, this sharing of a burden. You know, I hear of so many pastors that are burning out. Because and I think the reason for that, I'm not saying in every case, but very often the reason for that is that they're overburdened because they're trying to carry a load that God has said, you're trying to carry 300 pounds, but I asked you to do that together in fellowship with this other brother. You two men were supposed to be the ones carrying the load. Instead, here you are carrying it yourself. Sharing the burden. And like I said, you also see the example in the church. In the early churches, those verses I have there, if you read the book of Acts especially, and you'll see that, now there were individuals like Timothy and Epaphras and others that he sent as individual apostles. Eventually Timothy became a bishop in Ephesus, overseeing a number of different churches. But in the local church, it was always 2 or more elders. Go back to 1 Timothy chapter 5, and I'd like to show you now what he talks very specifically. Speaking to Timothy, again, a very practical book like we've been seeing in the last few weeks. I like how Paul established certain basic principles in the first few chapters, and then he made it very specific. He kind of narrowed and says, Timothy, these are some specific things I'm going to address in your life and in the lives of your home and in the churches there, and you need to do it this way. So he says in 1 Timothy 5, some responsibilities of an elder. And the first thing I see in verse 17 is that elders have a responsibility to rule well. Now, I think it's important that he uses the word rule here. Many people, and we see this very often when people come to ask us about the church and how we function as a church, they are concerned and then perhaps a little bit afraid. There's an aspect of fear of how they would interact with authority. They are afraid, and we hear this a lot, that elders who have taken advantage of them in the past, that they might run into a situation where they'll be like that too, where an elder will try to control their life or try to rule over them. Now I want to tell you this, that it is the responsibility of elders to rule. But the exhortation and the command to elders here is that you rule well. Yes, there is a rulership. If I told you as a parent, you know that you need to rule in your home, I think most of you would agree, if not all of you, that yes, you do need to do. You're not going to give the children just the freedom to do whatever they want. Says, well, yeah, I don't really like this ruler mentality. I'm just going to let the kids, I'm not going to rule over their lives. God will hold you accountable as a parent if you don't do that. And God is going to hold elders responsibility who have taken and accepted that call of God over their lives, who refuse to rule in the church, thinking, well, really, should I allow this to just go on in the church? Or do I take my responsibility as a ruler? But I want you to think about ruler in the sense in which it's that opposite pyramid, the Demurrer, if you will, where it's a ruler who's at the bottom and says, well, you can't just absolve yourself of any responsibility for the care of these lives of people who have entrusted their lives to you. You can't just say, well, I wash my hands off their life. No, you have a responsibility, elder. You have a responsibility, husband, wife, father, mother. And it's that same model of servanthood and responsibility that God is establishing in the church. So rulers must rule well. This is the verse I alluded to earlier that I'd like you to look at. It's a very, very, very important verse. This is a verse that if I could summarize, if I could just pick one verse in the New Testament that summarizes our relationship within the church as brothers and sisters, all of us, and then our relationship with elders and other areas of responsibility that God gives, it's this verse. I hope you'll memorize this verse, meditate on this verse, ask God to give you revelation on this verse. There's a lot of power in this verse. It's Hebrews 13, verse 17. 13 verse 17, Hebrews 13, 17. This is a command to the people in the church. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. And let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. So the command is not to the elders to exercise authority. It's not to, it's not telling parents, hey, you guys have decided to get married. No, go find some children to be parents too. It's not like that. The way that God works in most of the cases, and his ideal scenario is where the husband and wife get married and God gives them children, miraculously. God gives them children, and now he says, now you have to be a parent to those. I've given you these children. And it's just like that in the church. We're not looking, Phil and I are not looking for who else do I want to have responsibility for. Come become a member of my church. Come here, grab here, move here from this town. Oh, you need a church? Come here, move to Loveland. It's a great church. We don't operate that way. I think you know that already. We're not eager for people to move here and join this church necessarily. We want whom God wants. Has God given us the care of that person? Has God given us them as children in the church? Then we will be responsible for them. It's just like that in the home. As a parent, I don't look at your children and think, I wish that was my child. I wish I could just take them and keep them in my home and raise them up my children. We wouldn't do that. That'd be silly. But in the church, unfortunately, you see in Christendom, many people are trying to do that. Sheep stealers, going to this church and grab you from this church, grab you from that church here. Come attend our church. It's better. We're more wholehearted. We're more new covenant, this and that. We don't understand the model that God is establishing in the church. It's the opposite. And God will give you the care of children in your life, in your home, and in the church, and you better be responsible for those. See, I believe that Jesus was able to finish, I said this last week, I think, in 33 years, he finished everything that the Father gave him to do. You know why? He never overstepped his boundary. He was faithful to everything the Father gave him to do. That's why in 33 years, he could say, it is finished. It is finished. How? Because I only went as far as the Father allowed me to do. The Father gave me a church of 12. And at the end of it, he knew that those were the 12 that God had called him. At the end of his life, Jesus prays this prayer in John 17. He says, Lord, yeah, there was one day, I remember my church was about 5,000. And then it was 4,000 another day, and we fed him and all that. But these were the 12 you gave me. Here they are. I haven't lost even one of them except the son of perdition. He understood that care, that God had given him these 12. You mean, Jesus, after 3.5 years, your church is 12 still? What about evangelism and where is the growth coming from and all that? No, I understand the Father has given me a calling. Now, there is growth, but it must be growth from God. And as elders, we must understand that responsibility if we are to build the true church of Jesus Christ. If you want to build a corporate structure, you want to build a mega church full of everybody who is looking for a church, and so they move you from elsewhere, or we grab everybody from this town and say, here, come, we'll feed you, and we'll do this for you, we'll take care of your needs, come and be a part of this church. If we're building the church that way, what we're building is a pyramid, and one day we'll realize, like we said last week, it'll just burn up. Secondly, he says in verse 19, back in 1 Timothy chapter 5, the second responsibility I see here of elders is that their lives must be above reproach. 1 Timothy 5, verse 19. Do not receive an accusation against an elder, except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who continue in sin rebuke in the presence of all, so that the rest also will be fearful of sinning. This is a responsibility we have as elders, and that's secret. It's between me and the Lord, that our lives must be free from sin, above reproach. And if the Lord shows us an area of sin, I'm not saying we're perfect, but when the Lord shows us an area of sin, we confess it immediately, and we're not allowing ourselves to walk in sin, in continuing sin. That's a responsibility for all of us, but especially for elders. And I'll tell you here, there's an important principle that God holds leaders to the greater judgment. God will hold me, I've said this before in this church, and I'm not afraid to say it, but I do so with reverence before God and the fear of Him, that God will hold me accountable for the church and judge me first before He judges any of you, because He called me to be a leader in the church here. He will take you up, father, husband, first of all, before He passes judgment over your home. And He'll hold you accountable for your wife's spiritual condition and your children's spiritual condition first. Yes, it'll go on, and every adult, every person who has that ability to understand will be judged for whether they chose God or not, but it will start first with those whom He has given leadership. That's why leadership is not something you want to lust or covet after in a human way. Because when you see it the spiritual way, it says, okay, Lord, you're calling me to be a leader. I'm going to be at the bottom, and you're going to start at the bottom. You're going to work your way up and say, okay, well, husband, let me call you up first and says, what about your home? Tell me. Do you know the kind of music your children listen to and the kind of programs they watched? Or do you know their spiritual lives? Then he'll call the mom and says, do you know your children? Do you know what they were up to? And do you know how they interacted with the other children or this and that? Do you know? If you're a good husband and father, and I see you guys living that way, you know how your children are doing. You care for them. You're involved in their lives. You watch over them when we're downstairs and how they play with each other. That's being a responsible leader. But it's the principle that starts from the bottom up. Judgment will start with the one who has the most responsibility. And so I'm aware of that. You know Moses? The children of Israel, they could grumble and complain and call God names and call Moses names and worship the golden calf and do all kinds of stuff. And the kids still got to go into the promised land. And God gave them many times. And it was after many circumstances that he finally said, okay, you guys are not going in. Only your children will go. God gave Moses how many chances? Remember? One. Are you as a leader in your home or in whatever circumstance prepared for God to give you one chance only? Then you've understood leadership. Then you've understood that, well, Lord, wow. The judgment is greater on me now because I'm in this position of leadership. Now, for most of us, husbands and fathers, we didn't really necessarily covet it. We became fathers. We became husbands. We became leaders in whatever sphere of influence. You became a manager in your work situation. But now, having understood that you have that responsibility in whatever the sphere of influence, how do you deal with it? Do you stand before God and say, Lord, I don't know how to be a leader to these people that you've asked me to be a leader to. And I understand that you're going to judge me first, but give me grace. It ought to drive you to your knees, which it does to me very often. I says, Lord, I need grace from you to care for my wife and for my children and for this church. Will you please fill me with your Holy Spirit? And he will. God's not looking to judge you as a leader. He's not going to looking to just, dump that weight on top of you and hold you accountable for being who you are as a leader. He wants to help you, but he wants to see that you get sick and tired of realizing that I can't be a husband and a father the way God wants me to be. I know how the world expects me to be, but I can't be the way Christ is to me. And it drives you to your knees and say, Lord, give me grace. I humble myself and I lower myself. I remove the scoffer from me, as it were. It says, Lord, help me to be a leader. Living above reproach. And he also talks here, that's why if somebody comes and accuses an elder to you, don't listen to it for even a moment. Never refuse an accusation against an elder except in the presence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Why? God is going to judge that elder before you will. And you better not get in the way of God judging that elder. And it happens often where people talk about, I'll say this also, I'm not afraid to say this, that if you're talking about another pastor of another church, be careful. God may have allowed, even in his sin and even in whatever he might have, false doctrine and all that, be careful about how you speak about a leader of God's people somewhere else. I heard somebody say once in a recent message, a lot of people like to talk, well, the church has this need and the church is like that and the church is like that. And I think it was Carter Conlon said, be careful how you talk about the church. Despite all her faults, she's still the bride of Christ. She's still the bride of Christ, and Christ is going to say, that's my bride you're talking about. Yeah, I know I'm purifying her and sanctifying her. But if you're truly born again and part of the church, let's be careful how we talk about the church. Let's be careful how we talk about elders, for that matter, or even other leaders of God's people. I'm not saying that I defend false doctrine or anything like that, but let's do it with care. Let's do it from the Spirit of God. If there's a word of conviction and reproof or a word of warning where we see somebody's being led astray into false doctrine, let's do it in love and carefulness and soberness, realizing that God is his master. And that's still an elder whom God is going to hold accountable for. God is going to hold him accountable. Thirdly, he says in verse 20, 1 Timothy 5, verse 20, those who continue in sin rebuke in the presence of all, so that the rest also will be fearful of sinning. This is another responsibility we have in the church as elders, is to instill the fear of God by rebuking sin. If we as elders see sin in the church and are just afraid to touch it because we don't want to offend anybody, happens in a lot of churches where somebody could live in sin and we're just afraid to offend them because our membership might dwindle or the offering might be less. That's one of our rich donors. How can we speak into the sin in his life? If we don't instill the fear of God by rebuking sin where it needs to be done, carefully and publicly where needed, then we're failing in our responsibility as leaders, as elders in the church. The same principle applies in the home. If you see a situation, an attitude or a situation with one of your children, and you're afraid of offending that child where God has given you the care of that child and they're in your home, and you refuse to do anything about it to address it, my dear brother or sister, God will hold you accountable for it because that's your child. And that's how I look at it in the church. That's why we speak about sin so strongly. Sins like gossip, sins like lust, sins like anger, those sins that you may not hear in a lot of other places, because I have a responsibility to God, ultimately, to instill the fear of God in this place, in my own life, first of all, in my home, and in this church. I remember growing up, my dad used to say, well, if you don't have the fear of God, at least you'll have the fear of me. He used to say about himself. That the best is that you fear God. Then you'll fear the authority that He's placed around you. But if you don't, he says, if you, and what he was talking about there, and I'd make sure that you understand the context. It wasn't, well, he's just, around scaring people. It was if you love your sin and you don't want to change, and you're trying to bring sin into the church, and you bring that evil, sinful gossip or lust or whatever it is into the church, he says, if you're trying to sit here and continue in that sin and try to hide it, I hope that even if you don't fear God, which is what apparently you do because you continue in that sin, at least you'll fear me because you hear me speak about sin. And that was the calling that God had over his life. But I thought about that often, that he understood. That's why God gave him responsibility over, because he was faithful in little. In the little church that God started there in Bangalore there many years ago, he was faithful. He says, Lord, I'm going to be accountable for this little flock. I'm going to take care of them. And I'm going to make sure that this flock, the characteristic of this flock is they have the fear of God. And I want to instill that fear in them by speaking about sin and rebuking it where it's there. That's an elder who has understood his responsibility. That's a responsibility I have. Verse 21, he goes on to say, responsibility of an elder is to be impartial. Again, something that you'll see in a lot of the worldly churches, the pyramid scheme churches, if you can call it that, is that there's a lot of partiality. You treat certain people a certain way and other people another way. These are the rich people in the church, so they give more money to the church. I'm going to be partial to them. These are they're just the headache people in the church. I'm partial in that situation. He says, 1 Timothy 5:21, I solemnly charge you, Timothy, in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus and of his own holy angels. I think it's significant, this is the way it spoke to me, that Paul would invoke this seriousness, as it were. He says, I solemnly charge you, Timothy. Listen to the tone in his voice. I solemnly charge you, Timothy, in the presence of God. He invokes the name of God. In the presence of Christ Jesus, in the presence of his holy angels, that you maintain these principles without partiality. Don't treat anybody different in the church. This applies to elders, applies to all of us. There ought to be an impartiality in our dealings with each other. I'm not saying, I think with Jesus also you see that there were certain ones he spent more time with. But in his dealings, in the way he treated them, in the way he loved them, he was impartial with his disciples. That's why he's the ultimate leader. He's an example for us. Impartial. Maintain these principles without bias, doing nothing in a spirit of partiality. And partiality, you know what? It's not demonstrated in the outward actions. It's a spirit of partiality, that I can outwardly seem to treat two people the same, but have a spirit of partiality. It's inside. That's why I can never assess whether somebody is being partial or not by looking at the outward circumstance. Let me make this clear also. You could look at a circumstance and say, well, you're being partial there. And it might seem that way. To the other 9 disciples, it could have seemed that Jesus was being partial to Peter, James, and John. But there was the spirit of partiality that he addresses here. That Jesus was doing it because the Father had directed him a certain way. But we must be free of the spirit of partiality, which means that I'm not treating certain people differently from others because of some earthly preference that I have, because I get along with them better, or because I like the conversation they like to talk about. It's not about that. This is how God is trying to build a church, with a spirit of impartiality, where you find that God is actually calling you to be closely knit with somebody who has completely different interests from you. And then you say, if you have the spirit of partiality, you'll say, well, what do we talk about? I have nothing to talk about. It's not about that. It's about the Spirit being able to unite your hearts together. Verse 22, do not lay hands upon anyone too hastily and thereby share responsibility for the sins of others. Keep yourself free from sin. Keep free from every appearance of sin. This is also very serious. As an elder, as one who has responsibility in the church, as leaders, in whatever sphere of responsibility you have, keep yourself free from every appearance of sin. Nobody ought to be able to look at your life and say, well, look at him, look at what he's doing. Look at how he speaks, or look at how he treats his wife, look at how he treats his children. Look at how in that moment of anger he burst out like that. Keep yourself free from every appearance of sin. Now, we don't do it because I want a good testimony in the church, but because I realize that God is a holy God, and He's the head of His church, and it's a holy church that He is building. Keep yourself free from every appearance of sin. And finally, and this is very interesting, well, actually 2 more. He says another responsibility as a leader we have is not to be legalistic. And I think the reason that Paul talks to Timothy this way, where he says, don't drink just water, drink some wine. He says, the danger when you understand all these principles of being holy and living pure and keeping free from every appearance of sin, you'll think, well, okay, then I got to make sure that I don't drink any wine when people are looking, or I don't have these things that, even though they're not sin, people might take it the wrong way. He says, no, actually, you know what? Keep a bottle of wine in your closet, and somebody's going to come over to your house and say, Timothy, elder, what are you doing with that bottle of wine in your cupboard? He's going to say, don't worry about them. Be free from legalism. Don't let yourself become so legalistic in this pursuit of holiness. I think it's great that Paul has balanced it out this way. He's saying, Timothy, I know you want to be holy, and I know you think, well, okay, people are going to ask me, how come you're drinking wine for your medicine? Don't you trust God to heal you? Why are you taking medicines? Timothy, I thought you were a man of faith. He says, no, I am a man of faith, but God has told me in faith to take that medicine. Drink some wine for your sickness, he tells Timothy. Don't be so legalistic into thinking that you got to uphold this reputation of faith. There's a false teaching that God is going to heal every sickness, or there's a false teaching on faith. But there is such a thing as faith where God does bring healing into our lives, where when we're sick we can come to the elders, and it says the prayer of faith shall heal such a man, and his sins shall be forgiven if he has any. There is such a thing as true faith. But faith is grounded in God's Word, where I don't claim things that God hasn't promised in His Word. Are you looking for faith to overcome every sin in your life? You can be sure of that. Are you looking for faith to be healed from every sickness? I have never seen a verse that says God will heal me of every single sickness. He bore our sicknesses, yes. But He carried them on the cross, and God has allowed even some of His precious, precious children to die of sickness. But there's a triumph over that. The ultimate victory is not there in the sickness. The ultimate victory is in Christ Jesus, who conquered death. Oh, death, where is your sting? Oh, grave, where is your victory? That's the ultimate victory. If in the journey to that ultimate victory, God allows me to go through some loss and pain, so be it. My faith is in Him, in the fact that He has conquered death and conquered the grave. And I will never remain in that grave. God will not abandon my soul down there in the grave. That's my faith. Whatever journey He allows me to take through till then. Now, please understand, this is very important. We could be so imbalanced, and that's why I think Paul throws this in there. We can be so imbalanced where we think, okay, I'm not going to take any medicine, and there are certain groups of people that refuse to take medicine, and sadly, I know of people who have died doing that, refusing to take medicine. It's sad. At the other extreme are people who completely ignore that there is such a thing as miraculous healing. Both are extremes. But I say the narrow way. How do you know that you're walking the narrow way where you're not in one extreme or the other? Is that you're walking in faith in God. And if God puts a burden on your heart and says, Lord, I believe you're going to heal me from this sickness. But what should you say after that? Not as I will, but as thou wilt. Jesus said that same prayer. He said, Lord, I don't want to drink this cup. I don't want to drink this cup, but not as I will, thy will be done. In every prayer that you pray, if you think that you want to pray according to God's will, this is the way to pray it. Lord, I believe you want to heal me from this sickness. Please heal me from this sickness, but not as I will, as your will be done. This is the prayer that I honestly pray when I'm sick or my children are sick. Lord, very practically, Lord, I believe, I'm going to ask you in faith that you'll heal me of this sickness. And I believe that you bore this sickness on the cross, and it's not your will for me to remain sickly, so please heal me from this sickness. But if you don't heal me from this sickness, I want your will ultimately. I want to put my faith that you are going to accomplish something better through allowing me to have that sickness than if I had the sickness. Did you get that? I pray that God, you'll heal me from this sickness, and I pray, Lord, heal me, whatever it is, whether it's some situation or, I'm not talking about sin here, I'm talking about sickness. If God allows you an earthly circumstance in your life, and you say, Lord, I want you to free me from this sickness, let's use sickness as an example. Lord, heal me, please heal me, and I ask you, and I ask in faith that either you'll heal me or you'll accomplish something better through allowing me to keep the sickness if you don't heal me. You know where I got that example? Paul. He says in 1 Corinthians 12, or is it 2 Corinthians 12? He says, I prayed 3 times that the Lord would take this thorn away from my flesh. And the Lord finally said, no, I'm not. But I'm going to give you grace. I'm going to make something even better in your life through that thorn in your flesh. That ought to be our prayer. And so you pray in faith like Paul did. Lord, heal me. Lord, please heal me. Lord, please heal me. And one day the Lord might say, time to stop praying. I'm going to do a miracle in your life. I'm going to give you grace. We prayed for Christian, for Phil and Katie's son. Remember, we prayed for him, and we prayed, Lord, you're going to heal him. And Phil has shared with me, this is long before even I came here, he shared with us many times how the Lord really, oftentimes he would feel like the Lord's really going to heal him. And one day the Lord says, I'm going to take him. But I'm going to accomplish something greater through allowing him to die, through taking him, than if I had allowed him to remain. And I'll tell you, we are witnessing that in this church, and those of us that knew him, aren't we? God has done something. We won't fully understand why God couldn't have allowed that to still happen with him on this earth. We don't understand that. But we know, because our faith is in God, that he's going to accomplish something greater when we seek his will completely. So don't be legalistic. Another exhortation to leaders. And finally, he says in 24 and 25, the sins of some men are quite evident, going before them to judgment. For others, their sins follow after. Likewise also deeds that are good are quite evident, and those which are otherwise cannot be concealed. I think this is the way it came to me, is fight every form of hypocrisy. He says you'll see some sins that, well, it's just right there. God makes it evident. But just because God allows a sin to be concealed, just because you have the secret area of sin in your life and you're not yet caught, don't pat yourself on the back that it's okay, that sin has not yet been revealed. Every form of hypocrisy will one day be revealed. Every sin will one day be made manifest. Deal with it before it's too late, and it begins with the elders. He says, Timothy, take it seriously. Don't allow any area of hypocrisy in your life. Walk before God's face. Walk in the light. Fight against every form of hypocrisy. We'll close there. Again, some very practical teaching on leadership in the church. I set this as my goal of the kind of elder I want to be in this church, because God has expected that of me. And I know Phil shares that in our vision. We share that as our goal. And I hope that you've seen the principle here of this being a slave to all and humbling yourself even to the point of death on the cross. Let's pray. Thank you, Heavenly Father, your love. Thank you that you've shown us a way of true discipleship, sacrifice. You're opening the way through the flesh that Jesus Christ went, the new and living way. Help us to follow after it wholeheartedly, with all of our hearts, soul, strength, and mind, to love you. This is what it means to love you, Lord, I believe, to give ourselves completely to you. In Jesus' name, amen.